This is the start of our introduction to William Shakespeare and some of his works. And to begin with, I need to apologise for my speaking voice. I do have a cold at the moment, for which I apologise, but we're just going to have to persist with that, unfortunately. So this is our introduction to Shakespeare, where we're going to be looking at some of his works and his life and why Shakespeare is so important and why we still bother studying him 450 years on. On this page here, we can see a picture here which is most commonly used to represent what we think that William Shakespeare looked like. It's from the front of one of his folios, which was a collection of some of his written works. So this is what we think that William Shakespeare most likely looked like. So I suppose the burning question at this point is, who was William Shakespeare and why is he so famous? And I suppose, why do we still bother studying him 450 years on when we've all heard these stories about how hard it is to understand Shakespeare and how difficult it can be at school? So why do we bother? And my answer to that question is because he was actually really, really awesome at what he did, and he was primarily an entertainer, so what he produced was meant to be fun and it was meant to be exciting. And although some of the language may have changed, his stories are still really timeless. So there are a couple of ways to teach Shakespeare, and it can be really boring, but it can also be really, really fun. And we're aiming to do the really, really fun way of learning about Shakespeare. If we wanted to look at a bit of a summary of who William Shakespeare was and why we still pay attention to him today, this might provide a bit of a summary. He is widely regarded as the greatest writer in English literature. He lived from 1563 to 1616, so as I said, that's about 450 years ago. He was born in a place called Stratford-on-Avon, which is in England. He wrote about 37 plays, for which he's most famous today, and about 154 sonnets, which are a specialised type of poem with a special pattern, which we'll learn about later on. Shakespeare actually started out as an actor as opposed to a writer, and he started acting in a group called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. They were a London acting company. After a while, when he had been performing with the Lord Chamberlain's Men, he actually became a shareholder in the company, which meant he actually owned part of the company, as well as the primary playwright. So he started writing what they would actually perform. In 1599, when they had amassed a bit of money, the Lord Chamberlain's company, who he was working for and who he owned part of, built the Globe Theatre, where most of Shakespeare's plays were performed. And this is a picture down the bottom of what the Globe Theatre looked like. As you could see, it actually didn't have a roof. Because this was back in the 1500s, they didn't have any electricity, so plays would have to be performed during the day in the open air so that they could see. If they had a roof on it, it would be far too dark to see what happened. And as you can see, there are multiple tiers in there. There are multiple layers where people would sit up on different levels so that they got a good view of the play. So as we said earlier on, Shakespeare was part owner of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which was the acting company. He also became partial owner of the Globe Theatre, where they performed. So he held 10% of its shares. Really importantly, his plays were often performed at the court of Queen Elizabeth I. So this is a picture of Queen Elizabeth in the top, and we're going to learn about what life was like in Elizabethan England. So it's a really important point that they were performed at the court. Queen Elizabeth would only want the plays that she thought were most interesting and entertaining so that she could interest the people in her court, all her sort of friends and hangers-on, so she was always trying to impress them with these great plays. It also meant that for Shakespeare, he was a little bit torn. He would have to do plays that were amusing and entertaining, but they were also good enough for a queen. So it's a really interesting point, and we'll learn more about Queen Elizabeth and her taste as we go on. During the late 16th century, which is when Shakespeare was living, Elizabethan England actually experienced the plague, which you might have heard of as the Black Death. It was this really awful sort of disease that spread really easily if you were in contact with other people. So during the years of the plague, he would actually write poetry because theatres were closed, because if people are really, really contagious and spreading this deadly disease, you don't want to lump them all in one gigantic theatre and spend a few hours together. So he wrote poetry instead. It was also considered by the Elizabethans to be more important to write poetry than to watch plays. So I guess they were a little bit snobby in that sense. It was seen as a little bit more intellectual for him to write poems than to write plays. Shakespeare wrote in a variety of styles, and we sort of group them into three categories. He wrote comedies, which are largely plays that have a happy ending. He wrote histories, so about important people, such as Richard III. And he wrote tragedies, which, as you might guess from the name, were kind of really sad stories, kind of like dramas that would end really badly. So in modern terms, we'd kind of look at the comedies. We know what comedies are. They're those light, fun kind of movies that you go and watch in the cinemas. Histories would be more closer to, I guess, like a documentary style today. And tragedies, they're really your drama. That's when you know that, potentially something really bad could happen, and they keep you on the edge of your seat. One of the first questions that as teachers we get asked is, why do we still bother studying Shakespeare? But it's more than that. It's, why do people still love to watch and perform and study Shakespeare? Why do people choose to do this? Why do people still make movies about it? And why do we still have acting companies that perform it and people pay money to go and see it? One of the best reasons, and one that's used most often, is that his stories are considered universal, which means that the basic storyline itself apply to many different times and places and situations. So if you're looking at a story like Romeo and Juliet, which is a sort of boy meets girl, boy and girl falls in love, family gets in the way, boy and girl have trouble being together, that can translate to many different times and places and situations. That can still happen in the 18th century, and it still happens today. It's really, really common. It can take place here in England, it can take place in India, it could be a story in Africa. So it's called universal, that they're common themes that we all understand. Another thing is that his plays are full of action and drama and comedy. As we said, he was the entertainment of the time. You didn't go down to your local cinema because there was no film. You would go down to your local theatre to watch and enjoy something being performed. A lot of people couldn't read, so they didn't have books or interesting things to read. They'd go and they'd watch a play instead. And Shakespeare was just the best at making these really entertaining plays. Our fourth point here is that his use of language is so skillful. So for those of us who love words, it's just amazing reading some of the stuff that Shakespeare has written. He puts things in a way that no one else can. And we're going to look at how many words Shakespeare actually created, which we still use today, and how many really common phrases he created, which we use today as well. There's also many levels of depth in his plays, so there's plenty of exploration and lots of different ways that we can read into them and interpret them, which makes it a lot of fun as well. Shakespeare Today. Even today, we are constantly recreating Shakespeare and referring to him. You'll find lots of movies and you'll find parodies, even in shows like The Simpsons and Futurama and Big Bang Theory, shows like that, you'll see lots of references to Shakespeare that you might not even be aware of yet. Some films that are fairly recent that you might know of are 10 Things I Hate About You, which is a film with Julia Stiles and Heath Ledger, which is actually based on The Taming of the Shrew. There's Romeo and Juliet by Baz Luhrmann, which is an amazing visual film, which is based on the original play, Romeo and Juliet. There's She's the Man, which is a film that you guys might know, which is actually based on The Twelfth Night. There's an interpretation of Hamlet, which is called The Banquet, which is a sort of martial arts-inspired Asian film. And there's Romeo and Juliet, which you guys might know is the animation, the sort of Pixar version of Romeo and Juliet. So that's a version which has even been made for really young kids to understand. As we said, they're universal themes that everyone understands. There are heaps and heaps of YouTube parodies and lots of references in popular culture. So that's things that you see around in movies, in TV shows, in songs. And again, we're going to explore some of those because lots of the new contemporary recreations are lots of fun. One of the big controversies around Shakespeare is that a lot of people contest whether he actually wrote his own material. And to a certain extent, this is them kind of making judgment calls on Shakespeare's education. So I've said here, some people believe that it was impossible for Shakespeare to have written his plays because he didn't have much of an education. He was unable to learn aristocratic sports and manners, and, obviously, therefore, if he doesn't have aristocratic manners, he can't be smart enough to write these plays. They also said that he lacked the heights and depths of passion necessary to have written his plays, so they kind of said he almost wasn't kind of mature enough or didn't have strong enough emotions to be able to write it. Some people have even said, to have written this stuff, he must have had heaps and heaps of books. Show us where all these books are to prove that he's written it, which I think is a little bit harsh too. However, most of us are happy to accept that he wrote the plays and sonnets that bear his name. The vast majority of us think, everyone pinches an idea here and there, but Shakespeare's Language and the plays that he's written are so obviously Shakespeare, you can just feel it. Shakespeare was primarily a dramatist. He was making something to be performed for people to enjoy, so that people would enjoy spending 2 or 3 hours at the theatre watching something interesting. So his objective was to give pleasure and to entertain. His audience was actually everyday people. You might assume that people today who go to watch Shakespeare are people who want intellectual stimulation, people who think that it's really clever to go and see Shakespearean plays. But these were written for everyday people. They were mostly uneducated, and they were looking for an escape in the theatre because largely their lives were pretty miserable. As we said, people like Queen Elizabeth was having Shakespeare plays performed in her court, but most of the time, day in, day out, the people who were watching were peasants. He also wrote in verse, which gave him a more free use of words, and he plays with words a lot. Sometimes he writes formally, sometimes he writes informally, and we'll learn that as we progress. The main idea that I want to leave you with is that, believe it or not, it is possible to really enjoy Shakespeare. And that's what we're going to aim to do when we give you this little taste test of Shakespeare, so that you can see that it's not scary. He's actually a pretty amazing guy. And you don't have to understand every word or every line or even every scene in a Shakespeare play to understand what's going on and to get some enjoyment out of it. So that's what we're going to do with this unit. We're going to give you the tasty, fun little bit so you get an idea of how much fun Shakespeare can be.